what I want to do today is to share a paper that I intend to turn into an article pretty soon that fits quite well with the title of the workshop, which is Social Analysis of Penalty Across Boundaries. And in this case, well, it has a long title because there's a lot of things going on, but it's basically about the re-internationalization of Latin American penal struggles in that period between 1970s and the 2000s, where I propose to analyze how struggles between the penal field and the sub-penal field of criminal justice reform become internationalized in similar ways, and develop a greater dependency on US penal aid and penal criminal justice problematizations since the 80s and more strongly in the 90s. What I will do in this presentation is first locate this paper within empirical findings and discussions, then within theoretical discussions, within the theoretical agenda, which is basically what I will propose is an extension of field theory analysis to tackle what I call dependent penal fields. After that, I will present as quickly as possible the main research findings, and I will close locating the analysis within discussions on the one hand, policy diffusion, or studies of policy diffusion, on the other hand, studies of penal change in the Latin American region. So, what's the empirical agenda? A number of works have been showing that between especially since the 1980s, US policies and US models, criminal justice policies and models, have been increasingly impacting criminal justice and policy reforms first in Central America and then in South America, where we find, on the one hand, similar models, like, for example, the accusatorial and managerially reoriented criminal courts. We also find community policing. We can also mention drugs policies and many others. On the one hand, we have a convergence of policies across many administrations, and on the other hand, among many criminal justice systems of the region. On the other hand, we have a synchronicity. I mean, all these different models and policies are concentrated in a specific period, which is more strongly after the 90s and after that. And we need to account of, and this takes place in a variety of administrations, of different political orientation, from neoliberal to leftist administrations. And this has been documented by a number of authors. And even in cases in which we have political transitions, and in cases where we don't have political transitions, as in, for example, Colombia, or more contestedly in Mexico. So we need to account for the similarity of policies, the synchronicity of the process, and the greater salience of US models since the 1980s. Empirically, that's the challenge. And theoretically, we have two main approaches to account for this perspective. On the one hand, policy transfer studies, and on the other, what I will call neo-colonial theory or neo-colonial regime theory of perspectives. What does the policy transfer literature propose? This is basically the work of, at least in Latin America, the work of Maximo Langer, who explains, I concentrate in the criminal justice, criminal procedure reform in this presentation, but I can make an analogous argument to other policy contexts like community policing, drugs, etc. But for the case of criminal procedure reform, accusatorial criminal procedure reform, the main argument is that, at least from the policy transfer perspective, is that a network, an epistemic and activist network of activist scholars for Latin America convinced the US and Latin American governments to engage in those regional those reforms in criminal justice systems of the region. Now, in this perspective, what remains unexplained is, first, why does the US collaborate? Second, why are those the activists' perspectives? And third, why do we observe a change in policy contents in this policy transfer, in the policies and models that are being transferred? What is missing there, as I will argue, is an analysis of the national fields, specifically the national fields that propel this type of transfer, the periphery southern national fields. On the other hand, we have neo-colonial regimes analysis. This perspective recovers power, recovers relations of domination and inequality across national fields, but is less concerned, at least this perspective, with the origin of US policies. That is what is sidelined in this perspective. Second, there is not a much nuanced analysis of how this intersection of northern and southern criminal justice fields takes place. And the main question is, why do local reformers collaborate? Why do periphery reformers collaborate in this process? What I propose is to incorporate in this discussion a field theory analysis for periphery dependent penal fields following the developments of Monica Krause from the London School of Economics. And if field theory, for example, in the work of Page, of Joshua Page, used to concentrate in the context of penal fields, economic field, political relations between penal fields with the economy of with politics, the perspective here is less to talk about the relations of autonomy between the national penal fields with other social fields, the political field or the economic field, but to analyze relations of autonomy between national fields, among national fields. That is what Monica Krause calls autonomy from fields of the same level, national to national fields. That's one aspect of the analysis of autonomy among fields of the same type, policy fields in the north and in the south. And this is one of the levels I want to introduce that could give some light on the processes I want to explain. But then there is another relation of autonomy, which is a little bit more complicated, which is the relations between the national policy fields with fields of the same type, but of another scale. That means from a regional, in this case, from a regional scale. It could be also from a global scale, for example, the UN field of criminal justice policy. Why is this relevant? Because I will argue that these two relations of dependency or autonomy from other national and from other scale criminal justice policy fields operate as direct causes of penal change, of criminal justice change in these highly internationalized periphery penal fields. To put it a little bit more graphically, this will be internationalization one, changing relations of autonomy or dependency between national fields. We have the fields in the north and in the south. In each of those fields, we have struggles, and in each of those fields, we have agents struggling and engaging in what is a very important concept, which is that of international strategies, which is the use of foreign resources to gain struggles at home. That's a concept by Yves Desalé. This will be one aspect to analyze, the change in the relations between fields, between national fields, and the second dimension to analyze is internationalization. Two is the relation between national fields and a regional space of penal expertise and authority, which I intend to graphic and present in this way with a bigger, a greater number of agents. And what is very important is and this is the argument that I will make, is that with this kind of concept, which is what I do in the paper, is to trace the replacement or the change from a regional circuit of exchanges among national fields, which used to be mainly Latin American, and its increased solidity and codification and bureaucratization of the regional space through the creation of regional organs of criminal justice policy. And that's the story I want to tell in this, that I developed in this paper, which is going to be two stories. On the one hand, the greater dependency of southern penal fields or criminal justice fields from US policy capitals and resources, and at the same time, the greater dependency of national struggles from this regional space. And everything gets complicated because the process is one in which the US starts occupying a greater position also within this regional space of criminal justice expertise and authority. So now I enter into the narrative and into the evidence and try to produce evidence about the changes in the relation between national fields, the emergence of this regional space of authority, the insertion and incorporation of the US within this regional space, and the changes in the topics and in the modalities of struggle for producing criminal justice reform in the periphery fields. So I start with, in the first part, I describe what happened in Costa Rica. And Costa Rica is very important because in the 70s, Costa Rica undergoes a very important criminal justice reform. They changed the penal code, the criminal procedure code, and the prison, and the reform the prison. And what is interesting there is that this takes place mainly also involving international strategies, also involving foreign resources. But these foreign resources were Latin American ones, were Argentine scholars who participated in drafting the Costa Rica Penal Code in 1970 and the Criminal Procedure Code of 1973-1975. Also, there was an influence of the help and the aid of the Mexican scholars and bureaucrats, but this is not described in the paper. And what happened that after, and as these reformers of Costa Rica, which were mainly Costa Rican bureaucrats and justice officers, what did they do? After they have collected so much resources and discussions and papers and information, etc., they decided to create a regional organ. And they engaged in what I call an exportation strategy. That is, after the struggles or after the process of reform in Costa Rica, they created ILANUD, which is the Latin American Institute for the Prevention of Crime and the Treatment of Offenders. And by doing that, the Costa Ricans, which until then have had a quite peripheric role in the regional circuit of exchange, suddenly they became a central hub for producing a very specific Latin American type of expertise and policy orientation. That's between the 1975 and 1980 mainly. They start doing many things. They start leading the UN efforts and discussions about criminal justice and development. And they start also producing comparative research, something that no other national arena or national authority had. So they start producing a very specific type of policy capital. They start also becoming a center where a number of national academies and institutions from Canada, from Mexico, from Venezuela, and other places start to gravitate and participate in ILANUD, and they start getting funding. Not much, but some funding to produce those research. And in doing that, they also copied what was taking place in the within the Rome Social Defense and the UN Social Defense Research Institute in Rome, which is also the outcome of another exportation strategy in the 60s by Italian scholars. So what I argue is that this space, this regional space, became bureaucratized with specialized organs producing regionally relevant research and policy orientations, but mainly allied with other Latin American scholars and bureaucrats. There, the role of Mexico and the INACIPE is very important, but also the role of Canada. But even then, the US has at that moment started helping ILANUD through the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, and the first big research program of ILANUD is about statistics, and this is funded by the US. And the second big program is about prisoners on remand, with Eugenio Zaffaroni and other Costa Rican scholars in 1983, which was already also financed by USAID. But these are like quite ad hoc developments regarding the US involvement. What happens next is that in the mid-1980s, as I developed in the paper, the US, and then we have to turn north. We have to turn north and see what have been the struggles, not within the criminal justice field, but within the foreign policy aid field. And then with we started with the Reagan presidency and the problems in Central America. There are many battles between the executive branch and Congress, and administration of justice is added, is incorporated to foreign aid policy. And what I described there, and this is very important because this incorporation of criminal justice reform to foreign aid means the opportunity to new agents from the US to get involved in foreign policy. This is but not only from the US, also from Canada, from the International Center for Comparative Criminology. When I traced the biographies and the social trajectory of these scholars, a very important person there is Luis Salas, who was a Cuban emigre, who works in Florida International University and has a lot of experience in criminal justice reform in the state of Florida and in New York. Through that new program, new quite periphery scholars get incorporated in this policy program led by USAID and the US Department of State. And they launched in 1985 a very strong administration of justice program, which means a huge availability of funds to invest in research, but most importantly, to start intervening and modifying first the Central American and later the South American criminal justice systems. And how do they do it? Basically, they have bilateral programs with different countries, and also what I say is that they capture ILANUD. ILANUD itself from Costa Rica becomes the object of reform. ILANUD gets expanded, gets involved and aligned to this administration of justice programs, and gets internally modified. The former Ministry of Justice of Costa Rica, which was the director of ILANUD, starts working for USAID full-time, and the Argentine under director of ILANUD, which is Elias Carranza, who is an Argentine exile, gets displaced and keeps on working on his own projects. But the main function now of ILANUD is to serve as a bridge between the US policy program and the Latin American network of experts and authorities, which had cultivated in the early 80s. And what I described, the different ways in which the US got involved in this regional space. And what matters most from this process is that with the cooperation of the US, the ways in which criminal justice struggles or discussions start to take place in those periphery countries change. And what is very important, basically, what Salas and other scholars like Jose Maria Rico, who is also a Spanish immigrant that goes first to Canada and then starts working in Costa Rica, is to introduce the US style of producing reform, which is through the creation of national commissions, the creation of national assessments, and the concern in administrative and managerial aspects of the criminal justice system. What I do next, I show how those topics and those modalities of intervention modified the discussions and the struggles for criminal justice reform, even in Costa Rica, but also in Argentina, which has been a leading site for exporting criminal procedure. And I show how after 1987, what was originally a reform center on criminal procedure now incorporated court administration, and this reform was done through general assessment, national commissions, and a style of a forum arena that tries to produce not only changes in the administration, but previously political will to reform within the penal elites. And as we are running out of time, the last part of the narrative deals with the last big criminal procedure reform or criminal justice struggle that took place with the Chilean transition to democracy. And this case is quite special because now we can see how the new regional space of criminal justice authority impacts with all strength, it impacts very clearly on how the criminal procedure reform of Chile took place. First, there is the creation of national commissions, the ample justification of reform based on empirical data and empirical analysis. This, in turn, is spearheaded and promoted by NGOs that are financed by USAID, besides other local NGOs, which is part, all this type, and it's done and prepared through a 2 years forum that took place in Chile, oriented to produce this will for reform, and that was led by this local NGO with U.S. financing and I would say even direction or assistance, and that produced not only a massive refurbishing, and which is not a reform, but it's an institution building of the new criminal justice system of Chile, with new judges, new prosecutors, and defense service, public defense service, but also produces, just as it had happened in Costa Rica in the mid-70s, leads to the creation of another regional center, which is going to be the Justice Studies Center of the Americas in 2000s, which is going to be backed by USAID, by the US Department of State, by the Chilean Ministry of Justice, and it's going to be, on the one hand, funded by the US during the first 5 years. Then Canada takes the place, replaces the US as the main funding agency, but is led by Chilean agents from the Diego Portales University in a different galaxy, a different reformist galaxy, and a different regional space that now has new actors. On the one hand, you can see that the Florida International University and ILANUD get displaced, and other northern agencies become more central, like the National Center for State Courts, and the private consulting agencies like CHECHI and DPK. The outcome of this new Justice Center of the Americas is the the continuity and the continuation of these criminal justice reform processes, not only in Chile, but even in the old places where ILANUD and Argentines used to have that authority, which is even Costa Rica with a secular criminal justice reform towards a more accusatorial system, and provincial court reforms in Argentina, but also in Mexico and Ecuador, and in a number of other Latin American places. And to close, present the main conclusions of this presentation, which is analyzing two dimensions of national field autonomy. On the one hand, horizontal autonomy, that is relations with other national fields, and on the other hand, the vertical autonomy, sorry, this misspelling there, is in relation to other scales. We can describe how Latin American criminal justice fields became more dependent from US foreign policy, penal aid, and through that penal aid, from the US criminal justice field know-how and modalities of intervention. Second, there is a greater dependency of the regional space, from the regional space of criminal justice authority, which is also dominated by the US in what I call a vertical, Monica Krause calls a vertical autonomy. So what all this can allow us is first to understand, on the one hand, what was missing from the diffusion perspective, which is a very clear explanation of what are the incentives of the periphery activists and bureaucrats, but also what are the incentives of the northern activists and bureaucrats to get involved either in importation or in exportation through international strategies, and that is done and achieved by locating the actions of those activists within very highly structured criminal justice fields. Second, it allows us to recover the analysis of the internal struggles, allows us to account for the contents, the specific contents of the policies that are exported and the policies that are imported, and what propels agents to engage in that exportation and importation, and what are the changing contents of these policies that are being exported and imported and start to circulate regionally. And for me, the analysis is quite relevant because it explains, or it can give light on, the continuity of penal state making, that is the expansion of the penal capacities of Latin American states as a result of these international factors that makes penal state reform something attractive either to the neoliberal governments or to the leftist governments, as this becomes the regional consensus of what is to be a modern and progressive criminal justice reform and system, and that may be behind the continuous expansion of the criminal justice system in a variety and across many administrations with different political orientations. And that would be what I had to share with you. I thank you for your attention, and you can contact me.